Welcome to another deep dive. We're going to be plunging into the kinds of stories, the kinds of documents that really can reshape how you understand the world. Today, you are definitely in for an unparalleled journey. We're heading into the shadows of institutional control, an exploration that I think will challenge what you thought you knew about justice, mental health, and the very nature of power itself. We're taking a deep dive into a really extraordinary collection of sources today. We have an autobiography, some pretty stark legal documents, and a series of revealing press articles. And all of it centers around this clandestine institution, a place really shrouded in the narratives of those who experienced it firsthand.
Yeah, and what's truly compelling here, is how these different sources, they coalesce, they come together to reveal this really complex web. It's a web of what the author specifically describes as conspiracy facts rather than just, theories.
Facts. That's a deliberate choice of words.
Absolutely. And they paint this vivid picture of the profound challenges faced by individuals who are caught within a system that, at least by these accounts, operates with a very obscured, maybe even a hidden agenda.
So our mission today is really to unpack these firsthand accounts, these documented occurrences that happened within an institution the author calls Black Site Berlin. It's also known as penal psychiatry. Now, it's crucial to understand when the buyer calls this place a black site, they're describing it as, a disguised secret prison, a place where the personnel, according to the buyer, operate alternately on behalf of the German, the American, and the Russian states. All in the buyer's view, under the guise of an international deep state. We're going to explore the daily realities there, the alleged manipulation, and the really compelling narratives of the people caught within its walls.
And just to clarify the context here, drawing directly from our sources, the buyer believes this deep state is essentially an alleged shadow government structure, one that operates across national boundaries, subtly manipulating institutional systems like Black Site Berlin for its own hidden political and financial gains, often using seemingly legitimate processes just as a front.
Okay.
So we'll be focusing on the occurrences within this very unique institutional setting, primarily through the experiences of our central narrator. We're going to refer to him as the buyer from the World Succession Deed 1400, or just the buyer for short.
Okay, so let's start unpacking this really intricate system of guardianship. It's called betrayal in Germany, as the buyer experienced it. This system, it forms a key theme in understanding the alleged systemic control within Black Site Berlin.
Yeah.
And it paints a picture that goes, far beyond just simple administrative support.
Yeah, what's particularly striking here is how a legal framework, guardianship, which is, ostensibly designed to protect vulnerable adults, how it's depicted by the buyer as being, weaponized. Weaponized by what they call the deep state, operating inside Black Site Berlin. It's a very particular lens, isn't it, to view a system that's meant for care. But in the buyer's narrative, it's transformed into this tool of profound disempowerment.
And our sources, they describe how a large number of patients in Black Site Berlin actually have a guardian appointed, often against their will. This is a figure who, for example, manages their money, basically dictating how and when they can access their own funds. Now, it is acknowledged, the sources are clear, that a small number of patients actually do need and want a guardian for various legal, administrative, financial affairs. So there's a recognition that this legal instrument has legitimate uses.
Right.
However, the situation gets complicated very quickly because the Black Site itself, along with its resident social workers, already handles many of these tasks.
Huh.
For patients unable to manage money, for instance, the Black Site provides weekly allowances. They require applications for any purchases. They offer social worker assistance for communicating with external authorities. So the Black Site essentially functions as a de facto guardian already, which really makes you wonder, if the Black Site already provides so much comprehensive support, often fulfilling the core functions of a guardian, why is formal, often involuntary guardianship pushed so aggressively? And in some cases, imposed against a patient's wishes?
Yeah.
It creates this kind of double layer of control.
That's a critical point. And the buyer highlights this alarming and almost counterintuitive trend within the system. Some patients, even though they're deemed unfit by the institution, they actually desire a guardian for specific external errands. Something as simple as buying console games, for example.
Right.
Yet these individuals are, paradoxically, denied one by the courts. So what happens then? They resort to granting a voluntary power of attorney, basically placing themselves under guardianship voluntarily. And crucially, they have to pay for the service themselves. Wow.
Which is a luxury usually only afforded by patients receiving a pension. It shows a pretty significant disparity in access, even to self-imposed support. And the bitter realization often comes later for these patients. They find they've effectively disempowered themselves. They now have to, beg their guardian for their own money, having voluntarily surrendered control.
That's quite a trap.
It is. And if we zoom out, the buyer recounts how this very idea, this voluntary guardianship via a general power of attorney, was repeatedly proposed to them by various officials, psychologists. This wasn't just a one-off thing. It was suggested even when they were homeless, dealing with job centers, and then frequently reiterated inside the black site.
Okay.
This consistent pattern of suggestion, according to the buyer, it really underscores a deliberate attempt at control, not assistance. And the buyer interprets this persistent suggestion not as, a helpful offer, but as a clear and pretty insidious attempt at coercion. They actually describe it as vile extortion. They state very firmly that consenting to this would simply allow others to, quote, officially act in my name to enrich themselves at my expense. It paints a picture of systemic predation, really, rather than protection. And they argue that these attempts, these efforts to extract voluntary surrender of control, they should be met with severe punishment, not just, brushed aside. The buyer even gives this stark example from their time dealing with homeless aid, a proposition that basically boiled down to, just get a voluntary guardian. He'll take care of an apartment. Then you won't be homeless anymore.
Wow.
Which, to the buyer, wasn't charity. It was perceived as straight-up blackmail, leveraging their vulnerability to force them into this disempowering agreement.
That really brings up the whole question of individual autonomy versus state intervention, doesn't it? Especially when you view it through the buyer's lens of these conspiracy facts. Now, the German Legal Institute of Guardianship, the Betrayal, it was introduced back in 1992. It replaced the much older concept of adult wardship. And a crucial aspect of that reform was the abolition of full disempowerment. Generally, a person is considered legally capable in Germany at 18.
Okay.
Incapacity, though it can vary a lot in other countries, is specifically defined in Germany. For children under 7, for those between 7 and 18 who have limited capacity, and most relevant here, for adults with a pathological psychological disorder of mental activity excluding free will determination. In those cases, a declaration of will by someone legally incapacitated is null and void, meaning the guardian, not the person, decides their affairs.
Right.
So for the deep state, as the buyer describes it, it becomes extraordinarily tempting to place individuals like the buyer under guardianship, because this would then grant them the legal authority to act in the buyer's name, filing lawsuits, receiving funds, even redirecting money to a, quote, criminal organization, all without the individual's consent, involvement, or benefit. It basically sidesteps their will entirely.
And the sources, they detail this further, how court-ordered guardianship enacted by a German district court specifically applies to adults who are mentally ill, emotionally or intellectually disabled, or physically disabled, and are therefore deemed unable to manage their affairs either wholly or partially. The assessment, the determination of a person's capacity or lack thereof, it's made by a court-appointed expert. And this is where it gets really interesting, where the buyer's allegations become the starkest. They explicitly state that if this expert is a, quote, criminal henchman of the deep state and susceptible to bribery, which the buyer alleges happened in their own cases, then the assessment can be deliberately rigged. Yes, the outcome of such a manipulated assessment would be a declaration of a desperate, urgent need for a guardian, and this guardian, once appointed under these false pretenses, would then be empowered to conduct all sorts of legal transactions, file lawsuits, receive funds, and distribute them to their criminal organization, all, quote, behind my back, without my consent, against my will, and without benefiting me. It's a really comprehensive picture of systematic exploitation built on a foundation of alleged deceit.
It's also critical here to note the specific legal constraints mentioned in the source material. Constraints the buyer emphasizes are being, well, circumvented. German guardianship law is strictly national. Its authority stops at Germany's borders. It doesn't apply extraterritorially.
Okay.
Furthermore, and this is a key detail the buyer really highlights, persons with CD status, that's essentially diplomatic immunity or a similar protected international status, a status the buyer claims for themselves, they cannot legally be placed under guardianship under German law. The buyer's emphasis on these specific legal protections strongly suggests a belief that these very safeguards are either being ignored, manipulated, or just outright broken by these alleged deep state actors within Black Site Berlin to achieve their goals.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and move into the daily life inside Black Site Berlin. We encounter another really compelling character whose story is a stark illustration of the institution's dynamics and the complex interplay with external forces.
Hmm.
This is MG, known to many as the car arsonist. He's a houseworker on Station 10C, but his presence there, it carries a much heavier historical weight.
Yeah, a truly compelling aspect of MG's story is the profound psychological transformation he seems to undergo within the Black Site. And this is coupled with his extensive background in the far-left extremist scene. As the sources reveal, this history had really far-reaching political implications extending well beyond the walls of penal psychiatry, right into the realm of public narrative manipulation. This case really exemplifies how, in the pursuit of certain political narratives, state security agencies might be willing to leverage compromised individuals, questionable testimony, effectively trading factual accuracy for public perception, even when their legal efforts yield absolutely zero tangible results. It highlights a system where the face of the enemy is often, well, constructed rather than simply discovered.
So MG is described as this bald man, early 30s, who suffered a sudden and really severe heart attack right there on Station 10C. Intense chest pains, then he suddenly collapsed. He needed immediate transfer to a hospital, but the sources note that in Black Site Berlin, the arrival of an emergency doctor, it tends to take a bit longer than usual.
Right.
So until the paramedics arrived, the Black Site staff, they performed life-saving CPR. They kept him alive. Had they not done so continuously, the buyer states, he would almost certainly be dead. In the hospital, he got treatment, 3 stents apparently, and unfortunately had to be placed in an artificial coma for 4 months. Today, he bears visible scars on his neck from a tracheotomy, the procedure for artificial respiration during the coma. And this is where the narrative takes a really compelling turn. The buyer notes that this was the first time in their experience that Black Site staff seemed genuinely useful, performing truly life-sustaining measures. This traumatic yet life-saving experience, according to the buyer, led MG to develop this distinct form of Stockholm syndrome. He started seeing the Black Site staff as his saviors, his friends, even vowing to violently defend them from other patients.
Defend the staff?
Yes. The buyer, in a pretty telling observation, simply calls him crazy for this profound shift in allegiance.
That illustrates a really profound psychological shift, doesn't it? A complete reorientation of loyalty after a life-threatening event and perceived salvation. And if you consider the wider implications, MG's history is incredibly extensive, very politically charged. He's originally from Frankfurt am Main, not Berlin. And he'd been deeply involved in the far-left extremist scene for over 15 years.
15 years?
Yeah. His activities included participating in the notorious Black Bloc at the G20 summit in Hamburg, active engagement with Antifa, even working with the Rote Zora group, carrying out coordinated arson attacks against the German state. These weren't random. They were calculated strikes against property of state officials, police, investigators, prosecutors, judges, police stations, police cars.
Right.
Often using simple grill lighters to set vehicles alight, but carefully avoiding personal injuries. He was ultimately convicted as a serial arsonist across numerous cases. It took a staggering 30 trial days to address everything.
40 days.
Yes. His official diagnosis in this context included borderline personality disorder and pyromania, pathological arson.
Which immediately brings to mind the conditions inside the Black Site and the exploitation of even, dangerous individuals. MG, despite all his violent and politically charged history, earns a meager 0.66 sever per hour. 66 cents an hour as a houseworker on the station.
66 cents.
And for that tiny sum, he's tasked with cleaning isolation cells, even when the walls are smeared with feces. And disturbingly, he does this work without any specialized protective gear, risking contagion.
Wow.
The buyer identifies him as one of the biggest snitches on the station, a self-steller, someone who reveals himself because he genuinely believes the Black Site staff are his friends, blindly loyal to his perceived saviors. The buyer recounts this particularly bizarre instance. MG once betrayed his best friend on the station, reported him for having forbidden DVDs rated 18 or higher, only to then confess his own possession of similar items. Yes. And even more bizarrely, he confessed a phone brokering deal the same day it was made, a deal he'd arranged for a commission. This led to the phone being confiscated and sanctions for everyone involved. A real stroke of genius, the buyer remarks, very sarcastically, highlighting MG's profound lack of self-preservation in his eagerness to please the staff.
And this leads us directly to these various press articles that shed more light on MG's background and his controversial role. They show how his personal story really intersected with public narratives and state interests. One article titled 2.5 Years Imprisonment for Car Arsonist MG from 2016 reports on his conviction for attempting to set 3 cars alight in Lichtenberg.
Got it.
His stated motive to the court: revenge against former left-wing friends who he felt had mistreated him. He claimed he'd been threatened by the scene, accused of being a traitor and police informant since leaving them. Facing a regular witch hunt online, accusations that he had snitched on them to the police. He was caught by a plainclothes patrol, admitted his actions weren't long planned, but driven by this desire to stick it to the left-wing scene. The damage was minimal, around 1,300 to 1 Skoda. The court considered his confession, his remorse, the minor damage as mitigating factors. But the sentence was aggravated because these attempts happened just 8 months after he'd served a 2-year sentence in Hamburg for similar acts, and while still under supervision. A clear pattern.
But here's the crucial twist, isn't it? Another press article, provocatively titled, "Police Arrest Their Own Informant," reveals a far more complex picture. This piece reports that MG was, in fact, a confidential informant for the Verfassungsschutz, Germany's domestic intelligence agency.
And their own informant.
Exactly. His arrest for attempted arson involving an old caravan, among other vehicles, was particularly explosive because it directly implicated the Regier 94 squad, a well-known and significant left-wing stronghold in Berlin. The article suggests this arrest success was a kind of double-edged sword, maybe even a bitter irony for the LKA, the State Criminal Police Office. Because MG was a known figure, someone who had previously been cast out of the left-wing scene precisely for collaborating with police and the Verfassungsschutz. His history was public knowledge in those circles. It made his capture a very complicated victory.
That observation really resonates with a broader pattern described in the sources. MG's statements were demonstrably instrumental in the Verfassungsschutz, elevating Regier 94 to be considered the headquarters of militant autonomists.
Huh?
That designation was confirmed by leaked interrogation protocols. His arrest, happening close in time to these TAG-X actions, retaliatory responses to the potential eviction of Regier 94 raised questions.
Like what?
Specifically, it was noted that the cars he was allegedly setting alight were just small cars in Lichtenberg, not the typical targets or locations for autonomous groups.
No.
This discrepancy led to speculation, highlighted by the source, that such actions, which were eagerly picked up and amplified by the press, were maybe deliberately designed to manipulate public perception. To discredit activists, potentially as part of a broader counterinsurgency campaign orchestrated by the Verfassungsschutz, it suggests a strategic use of a compromised individual to shape political narratives.
And there's this leaked file titled "Hallucinations After Alleged Left-Wing Scene Defector," which paints an even more disturbing, almost theatrical picture. It alleges that for years, Berlin security agencies had been desperately searching for evidence of a command structure in the autonomous scene, a hierarchy they struggled to prove existed.
Right.
Then MG, described very pointedly as a psychologically ill supposed Antifa defector, suddenly takes center stage in this official narrative. According to this document, after his arrest for property damage, MG effectively wrote the script that influential politicians like Frank Henkel and Tom Schreiber then followed.
He wrote the script.
That's the allegation. This led the LKA and the Verfassungsschutz to explicitly agree to frame the Regier 94 House Project as the central hub, the centrale of left-wing extremist violence. This wasn't just a conclusion they reached, it was, as the source suggests, a constructed narrative.
And over several years, from 2009 to 2015, various LKA actions and political statements seemed to build this narrative brick by brick. You see a trend. 2009, burning cars lead to cell tower data queries, but no arrests. 2011, SPD's Tom Schreiber openly calls for raids on left-wing extremists. January 2012, Interior Senator Henkel defends extensive video surveillance. Police admit collecting millions of traffic data points without notifying anyone.
Wow.
Then, a police operation at Regier's Strand 94's Katterschmied event. Despite no concrete misconduct observed initially, it escalated. Police claimed attacks, justifying a warrantless entry based on Gefahr im Verzug, imminent danger. This systematic accumulation of incidents and official responses, often lacking direct evidence, really laid the groundwork.
Then, July 2012, a significant turning point. MG gets arrested in Hamburg for property damage. During his interrogation, he not only confesses to arson, but makes this crucial offer. He volunteers to actively support police investigations into vehicle arsons. clearly hoping for a reduced sentence.
Mm-hmm.
But the bombshell wasn't just his confession, it was the breadth of his subsequent statements. He identified individuals involved in protests against a Nazi march in Hamburg. And even more crucially, he specifically accused named persons from the Arab group whom he claimed frequented the Katterschmied at Rig Air 94 of attacking a police car with Molotov cocktails and stones in Kreuzberg and burning police vehicles in Hamburg.
Serious accusations.
Very serious. And he confidently stated that he himself belonged to the Berlin Antifa scene, which lent his accusations this veneer of insider credibility.
Which makes you wonder, again, about the reliability, the ethics of using such a witness, especially given his psychological profile. On July 20, 2012, a Berlin LKA officer conducts a video interrogation where MG elaborates further. He portrays the Katterschmied not just as a hangout, but as a control center for a violent scene.
A control center.
Yes. He claimed that everything that happens in terms of attacks against police, banks, gas stations, and cars was planned daily right there. He explicitly stated, quote, "We have a retreat point at demonstrations and also before demonstrations where we discuss politically motivated acts." He even alleged Arab members confessed various crimes to him in the Katterschmied, and his motive for making these extensive, damaging statements, it was laid bare at the end. "I want to leave this scene, and I would help in every way to catch these people, identify them precisely, even go back into the scene and maybe hand them over directly." He offered himself up as a full-fledged informant.
And the political reverberations from these statements were immediate, far-reaching. By March 2013, the Berlin Verfassungsschutz report officially designated RAB as Berlin's most influential autonomous group, and crucially, explicitly branded Rig Air 94 as the central institution of the violent autonomous scene.
Wow.
This narrative wasn't a one-off either. It continued into the 2014 Verfassungsschutz report, which directly quoted the terminology apparently crafted with star witness MG, firmly framing the House Project as the starting point in retreat from militant actions. It shows how a narrative, allegedly based on a psychologically vulnerable informant's testimony, quickly became official government intelligence.
And over several years, figures like Interior Senator Frank Henkel, CDU, and SPD politician Tom Schreiber, they aggressively pushed this narrative of left-wing terror. They used MG's statements to justify increased surveillance, harsher measures, consistently linking it all back to the Rig Air 94 project.
Wow.
They consistently condemned left-wing violence, labeled it terror, decried no-go areas in Berlin, called for more police, special investigation units for Rigarstrasse, harsher measures, stricter control of scene pubs, even securing roofs to stop projectiles. Schreiber, in particular, was very vocal, tweeting about the disgusting left-wing autonomous scene, advocating a hard hand, hard pressure, quick convictions.
Strong language.
Very. What's more, in February 2015, MG launches his own Twitter account, regularly reporting on his alleged Antifa activities, mobilizing contacts for events. The sources imply it would be, well, unrealistic to assume the LKA or Verfassungsschutz had no continued interest in working with him after his earlier offers to help. MG himself even offered to curry favor with R94, suggesting this ongoing, complex relationship with the very scene he'd apparently defected from.
So what does all this actually mean for the legal outcomes? The tangible results of this huge politically charged campaign, the juristische Folgen, the legal consequences section of our sources, it tells a really telling story. Aggressive action yielding minimal results. The phone data collection from 2009, the video surveillance, the dramatic storming of Katterschmied in 2012, the searches, the DNA extractions in 2013. None of these actions, despite their scale and all the rhetoric, led to a single indictment of any suspect.
Not one.
Not one. In fact, some lower court decisions that did emerge were even overturned by higher courts. And crucially, MG's statements, the very core of this star witness narrative that triggered more searches, more DNA collection, ultimately yielded zero evidence and zero indictments.
Zero.
Zero. It's a really stark contrast between the significant police and political resources deployed and the complete lack of legal success.
Which immediately brings up the question of the actual motives behind these actions, right? If legal success wasn't the primary outcome, the Politische Linie, the political line section, suggests that security agencies, in their fight against left-wing violence, aimed not just for convictions, but maybe to give a face to the enemy. This was done partly to construct these criminal organization charges under German law, Section 129, and, perhaps more significantly, to manipulate public opinion. regardless of ultimate legal success. It highlights how political figures like Frank Henkel and Tom Schreiber overtly used MG's, quote, delirium for what the sources call their transparent competition for the reputation as Berlin's most populist politician.
Oh, yeah.
They linked this narrative to their dreams of a purified capital free of disruptive house projects. The real scandal, according to these sources, isn't the mentally ill wannabe autonomous individual, but rather the willingness of the authorities to use his statements, even though the interrogating officer herself expressed palpable doubts about their veracity and MG's actual access to the scene during the interrogation.
So they knew. Or suspected.
The source suggests the officer had doubts, yes, which points to a deliberate choice, perhaps, to prioritize a political narrative over factual integrity.
And ultimately, the buyer concludes that MG is no traitor because, in the buyer's view, he had nothing real to betray. His statements were completely lied. However, the buyer is now almost certainly acting as a provocateur, or V-man, that's a confidential informant, given the stark discrepancy between his police statements and his current Twitter positions. Positions which, rather than being neutral, also pose a threat to Berlin's left-wing structures. It paints a picture of this man whose complex, maybe manipulated role just continues to evolve. Okay, let's transition now to another really compelling figure within Black Site Berlin, a patient the buyer refers to as the werewolf of Berlin. His story is chilling, it's poignant, it intertwines brutal violence with a really heartbreaking personal history and an unexpectedly passionate devotion to film.
Yeah, what's most striking here, I think, is the stark contrast between his gentle, deeply knowledgeable, cinephile persona and his documented history as a triple murderer. It really underscores the profound complexities of mental illness and violence, especially when confined within a carceral setting like Black Site Berlin. It forces us to confront the idea that the face of violence can be incredibly layered, unexpected.
The buyer says they connected with him immediately, describing him as a walking film lexicon. This man had worked in a video store for years, remembering countless film details, actor names, film lengths, plot lines, all from memory. He maintained this huge personal film collection, buying more during his supervised outings from the Black Site, which he generously shared with the buyer. They even watched films together, sometimes borrowing a projector from another patient to cast images across the entire cell, making it feel like a private cinema. But the crucial twist is, despite this encyclopedic film knowledge, his general memory was astonishingly terrible in other areas. He frequently asked the same question 3 times in a row, which led him to come across as, well, the buyer says, mentally retarded. The buyer recounts this humorous but ultimately telling anecdote. The werewolf borrowed about 30 Xbox One games from the buyer over 2 months.
Okay.
Then, upon borrowing Devil May Cry 5, he exclaimed in surprise that it was finally a game you can save.
Oh, no.
Implying he had been restarting all the previous games from scratch every single time he played, never actually getting to the end. The buyer had wondered why he returned games that could be played for weeks after only a few days. He simply never got far enough to really enjoy them.
That makes you wonder about the long-term, just devastating impact of severe mental illness, doesn't it? Especially when you trace his steep psychiatry career right back to his earliest childhood. His mother, apparently completely overwhelmed by his psychologically disruptive behavior, placed him in a children's home at the age of 5, just 5 years old. From there, he moved through a staggering 7 different foster families, always displaced because of his persistent psychological issues. A pivotal and tragic event happened in one foster home. He experienced this profound psychosis after watching Star Wars 3.
Star Wars.
Yes. He began to believe that green, pig-like aliens were about to invade the house, saw them everywhere, especially behind curtains. In a panic, he woke all 7 of his foster siblings, warning them hysterically about these imaginary intruders.
Oh, goodness.
This terrifying episode led to his immediate departure from that family and his first prescription for psychopharmaceuticals, marking the beginning of this lifelong struggle with medication. He also tragically endured sexual abuse in one of these foster families, for which he later successfully sued for damages, highlighting the deep trauma embedded in his early life.
And his childhood, as detailed in the sources, was tragically marked by violence. Not just experienced, but also perpetrated. He was a school dropout, no diploma. From a young age, he resorted to aggression to solve problems. Disturbingly, this extended to harming animals. A detail the buyer connects to a typical serial killer career, noting that many psychopaths first act out violent fantasies on defenseless animals before escalating to humans. And indeed, in his later life, he would become a triple murderer. As a teenager, unrequited love for a girl his age led to this horrifying act. He unexpectedly pushed her in front of a moving car,
Oh my God.
an attempted murder that luckily failed. The girl survived by sheer chance. He'd been prescribed strong psychopharmaceuticals since childhood, but later in life he began self-dosing them higher, often mixing them with alcohol, illicit drugs.
A dangerous combination.
Extremely. This cocktail, the buyer notes, consistently triggered severe psychotic episodes. During these phases, he was utterly convinced he was a werewolf, crawling on all fours, howling at the moon, believing he possessed superhuman strength, was invulnerable, immortal, and compelled to hunt people.
Hunt people.
Yes, it was during these times that he would attack random passers-by without warning or reason, engaging in countless brawls, including one infamous incident where he, while drunk, single-handedly beat up 3 bikers.
And to truly grasp the depths of his current remorse, which the sources mention, we first have to confront this harrowing journey of his internal struggle before the crimes. Before the murders, he vividly heard voices, internal commands that hurled insults at him, repeatedly ordering him to commit suicide.
No.
These voices were so powerful he literally had to sprint across bridges instead of walking just to resist the overwhelming urge to jump. In one particularly harrowing instance, the voices forced him to climb onto the railing of a bridge. He clung on, ready to let go, until his strength utterly failed.
And no one helped.
Despite passers-by, cars, no one came to his aid. With the last vestiges of his strength, he fought against the voices, which incessantly urged him to release his grip, and managed to pull himself back to safety. Following this terrifying experience, he himself tried to get admitted to a psychiatric clinic. He sensed the impending doom for himself or others.
Right.
Tragically, the clinic rejected him. The reason given, he was already taking too many medications. That's what the source says. The buyer suggests that if he had been admitted at that critical juncture, the ensuing tragedy, the triple murder, would most likely not have occurred, a critical missed opportunity for intervention.
And then came the devastating triple murder. After a day of mixing medication, alcohol, drugs, he experienced a complete blackout while visiting a friend's apartment. When he regained consciousness, the apartment was utterly destroyed. His good friend lay brutally beaten to death, so badly disfigured he was unrecognizable.
Oh, God.
To this day, he has no memory of the event itself. He managed to escape the apartment undetected, though he imagined police helicopters pursuing him, fantasizing about searchlights. 2 weeks later, the terrifying pattern repeated. Another mix of substances, again in a friend's apartment, watching soccer with 2 drinking buddies.
Not again.
He blacked out again, violently attacked his 2 companions. When he awoke, the apartment was devastated. Both friends were dead, killed by his fists and various objects found there, like scissors, bottles. Again, a partial amnesia. Unable to recall the actual acts of violence, he is, in the buyer's blunt words, a triple killer, primarily using his fists, with a documented history of brawling and, maybe unsurprisingly, a fondness for martial arts films.
But what's fascinating here is his current state within the black site, a profound contrast to that violent history. He expresses deep remorse, states he wishes he could swap places with his victims, die to bring them back if that were possible. On the station, he receives the most and the strongest medication prescribed. He's been in therapy for an extensive period, about 15 years. Crucially, he's fully aware of his illness, entirely willing to engage in therapy. But the buyer observes that it all seems to be of no use, which leads us to a specific recent incident. He attacked the buyer's nightmare neighbor on the stairs, completely unprovoked without uttering a single word.
Attacked another patient.
Yes. Black site staff intervened. One of the nurses who stepped in stated that the werewolf surely would have beaten my nightmare neighbor to death had he not intervened. The werewolf was described as psychotic, pale, sweaty, blank stare, completely unresponsive. Later, unable to recall the exact events of the attack, offered multiple conflicting versions, including a nonsensical one about being attacked from behind by an unseen third party, and instead of fighting the unseen attacker, he turned and lashed out at the nightmare neighbor. Clearly points to a persistent, deeply embedded psychotic state.
And this is where the narrative takes another compelling turn, revealing the buyer's very particular perspective on justice within Black Site Berlin. While acknowledging the werewolf's deep psychosis, the buyer views this specific act of violence not as a tragedy, but as a heroic deed, stating pointedly because it hit the right person.
A heroic deed.
Yes. The buyer claims the entire station, rather than being horrified, actually rejoiced at the nightmare neighbor finally getting a beating. As a thank you for this perceived act of justice, the buyer even visited the werewolf shortly after, gave him chocolate, and a poster from a magazine.
Wow, okay.
Despite warnings from other patients about the werewolf's extreme danger, the buyer claims to have no fear, never worried about being attacked, even though the werewolf had, in a psychotic rage, killed his best friends. It's a very unusual telling reaction to such profound violence.
In press articles, they further confirm the brutality and tragic circumstances of his crimes. They provide that external, factual corroboration to the buyer's internal narrative. An article titled, "Expert Declares Brutal Killer Mentally Ill Committed to Clinic. The triple murderer of Brits identifies him as Patrick M., 25, arrested in a friend's apartment in Neukölln. He was indeed committed to a psychiatric clinic. Police investigated him for other murders, indicating a broader history of violence. Fingerprints found in both murder apartments directly linked him to the scenes. He admitted being present but remembered nothing else, consistent with the buyer's account of amnesia. Neighbors described him as aggressive, threatening, breaking doors, regularly taking pills. One victim, 35-year-old Mick Seahouse, was tragically a friend of Patrick M.'s father.
Oh, awful.
The horrific nature of the murders, including one victim having their nose ripped off, was directly attributed by investigators to his severe psychological illness. Another article, "Three Dead in Brits Accused Cannot Remember," from January 2011, portrays Patrick M., then 26, as an unobtrusive young man in court, but details the horrific killings of Mick S., 35, Jürgen 61, and Fritz P. 50, all from the Brits drinking milieu. He remembered drinking beer, playing chess with Make S., then a confused daydream of a masked man, and wakened to Make S. bleeding to death. Claimed he wanted to help but felt too weak. His lawyer acknowledged Patrick M.'s likely culpability despite the memory gaps, citing 3 other cases of violence, including attacking 2 old men at a snack stand in 2009, jumping on them, causing severe injuries, because he thought they were talking badly about him. The prosecution sought placement in Maßregelvollzug, Germany's system for secure forensic psychiatric treatment, like a closed prison psychiatry. Based on forensic psychiatrist Hans Ludwig Kroeber's preliminary diagnosis of schizophrenia and continued dangerousness. This convergence of accounts just paints a consistent and deeply disturbing picture of a severely ill individual whose violence was inextricably linked to his mental state.
Okay, our next encounter takes us to a particularly unsettling corner of Black Site Berlin, one that really highlights the grim realities of patient exploitation and apparent institutional negligence. This is the story of the house slave, a 67-year-old man from Mainz whose quiet demeanor masks a shockingly violent past.
Yeah, what's most striking here is that stark contradiction again between his outwardly gentle, confused, intimidated demeanor and his shocking history as a 4-time serial killer. It underscores how such vulnerability, combined with his significant financial resources, makes him this undeniable target for exploitation within the institution.
Right.
And it reveals a profound lack of oversight. The tragic exploitation of this house slave reveals a really disturbing institutional apathy. Despite explicit awareness of patient-on-patient abuse and having the means to intervene, the Black Site's inaction highlights how a duty of care can be just tragically neglected, especially when the victims lack agency and their exploiters face absolutely no consequences. It's a stark look at the moral compromises within these systems.
So in 2024, the buyer describes this 67-year-old patient from Mainz as a very confused and intimidated individual. Always friendly, always courteous, which ironically makes him an easy victim for the predators on the station.
Yeah.
A buyer explicitly states that he functions as the personal servant and house slave for their nightmare neighbor, painting this picture of systemic patient-on-patient abuse.
A house slave.
Yes. And the most unexpected detail emerges here. Because he receives a pension, he is financially well off, reportedly having an astonishing 100,000 euro saved in his bank account.
100,000 euros?
That's what the source says. This considerable wealth naturally attracts vultures among the other patients.
Yeah.
During his supervised outings from the Black Site, he brings back groceries specifically for the brazen patients who have no scruples to exploit him. The buyer explicitly calls this practice disabled abuse. The nightmare neighbor, and another patient referred to with the deeply disturbing moniker pedo godfather, are singled out. They give him long shopping lists and then pay him little or nothing for the items, justifying it by saying he receives a pension and has enough money.
Unbelievable.
The buyer observes that since the house slave has no release perspective, he won't be able to spend his accumulated money before his death. And so this degenerate person especially gifted the morally most broken ones who demand it from him. The implication is his resources are just being siphoned off by those who are most ethically bankrupt.
Which immediately brings up the question of the Black Site's responsibility, doesn't it? its apparent failure to uphold its duty of care. The buyer consistently refused gifts from the house slave, found the exploitation of a mentally disabled person morally unacceptable, something they couldn't reconcile with their own conscience. The buyer even attempted to intervene, directly confronting the predators, urging them to stop their exploitative behavior. But these attempts were completely ignored. And disturbingly, despite these facts being known to the clinic, meaning black site staff were fully aware of what was happening, not a single black site employee stepped in to prevent the abuse.
Oh, did anything?
According to the buyer, no. Stepping back, the buyer highlights that the clinic actually possesses many means to effectively stop this. For example, they could transfer the exploitative patients to other stations, physically separating them from their victim. They could revoke the self-catering status of these predators, restricting their ability to compel the house slave to buy things for them.
Okay.
Or, at the very least, a psychologist could confront these individuals, officially document their behavior for future evaluations of their dangerousness. A record that would exert the greatest pressure on patients seeking release. Yet the clinic does nothing of the sort, according to the buyer, leaving the poor, mentally retarded man to his fate as a rightless slave, despite their official duty of care and knowing full well the extent of the abuse. It paints a picture of deliberate inaction.
So what does this all mean for this man, this house slave who seems so vulnerable? The sources reveal a truly astonishing truth. This seemingly delicate and confused individual has been in Black Site Berlin for 36 years. And despite his outwardly gentle nature, he is, in fact, a serial killer with 4 men on his conscience.
4 men?
4. His first killing was in 1975, when he was just 18, in Mainz. He'd rebuffed unwanted homosexual advances from a man in his apartment, pushed him firmly backward. The man fell, hit his head on a radiator, died from the injury. However, he was acquitted of this crime.
Acquitted?
Yes, because the victim had plied him with alcohol, locked him in the apartment, demanded sex, and at that time, homosexuality was still criminalized in Germany.
Ah, okay. The historical context matters there.
Definitely. About 10 years later, 1986, while heavily intoxicated, he was rampaging on the street. 2 passers-by, maybe underestimating him due to his non-threatening appearance, tried to intervene, calm him down. This was a grave error. He suddenly, unabashedly pulled a knife and stabbed both of them to death. 2 for 1 is the buyer's chilling description.
Good grief.
By 1994, he was free again. But his violent pattern continued. While heavily intoxicated in a pub, he had warned his 4th victim, when sober, not to provoke him when he was drunk.
He warned him?
Yes. The victim, underestimating him physically and psychologically, ignored the advice, started a fight, then boom, a stab right to the heart, and the drinking buddy was dead before he hit the floor. It's this terrifying cycle of violence fueled by alcohol and a perceived lack of inhibition.
Which immediately brings up the question of the cyclical nature of his violence, right?
Yeah.
And the profound impact of alcohol on his personality. The buyer describes him as a total victim type when sober, consistently shying away from any conflict. But the moment he becomes drunk, he undergoes this terrifying transformation, becomes a ruthless killer with no inhibitions whatsoever.
Wow.
He himself foresees that after release, he would inevitably relapse into drinking schnapps and commit another murder, stating quite plainly he could not resist the temptation. He distinguishes between alcohol types, considers beer and wine harmless, safe, but asserts that schnapps turns him into a killer without remorse. He dreams daily of intoxication, can monologue for hours about different types of alcohol, their origins, tastes, demonstrating this deep, almost obsessive preoccupation with the substance that unlocks his violent alter ego.
And yet, despite this stark self-awareness of the devastating impact of schnapps on the station, he still actively buys and consumes alcohol at Black Site exorbitant prices, a pattern he's maintained for decades inside the institution.
For decades?
Yes. When drunk, he always rages and destroys Black Site property. He's even shown the buyer various damaged bathrooms, room doors, hallways as concrete proof of his past rampages, a clear indication that despite everything, the pattern of drinking and violence persists. The one positive change noted is that he no longer consumes self-made alcohol, which would be readily available. He restricts himself to industrially produced hard alcohol, which is less accessible, has to be smuggled in. Surprisingly, the buyer even suggested he try cannabis for relaxation, reasoning that it relaxes doesn't cause aggression.
Okay.
But he strictly refused this suggestion due to prejudice, preferring his tried and tested killer brew over what he considered an unknown, perhaps stigmatized alternative.
What I found most striking here is that final, unexpected detail about his personality. It shatters any preconceived notions you might have. Outwardly, he presents this very conservative image. Short, neat hair, old-fashioned cut, dresses in old man-style shirts, corduroy pants.
Right.
You might expect him to listen to old German Schlager music, watch public TV for older audiences, maybe enjoy sentimental Heimat film.
Sure.
However, in stark contrast to this appearance, he loudly plays death metal music of the coarsest kind in his cell, listens to nothing else, displays complete intolerance for any other genre, a true old-school death metal music Nazi, as the buyer provocatively describes it, just to emphasize his extreme intolerance for other music.
Death metal.
Yes. He even moshes in his cell in the evenings, fully embracing the aggressive energy of the music. And instead of Heimat film, he secretly procures and enjoys brutal horror and splatter films.
Wow. That is unexpected.
It really makes you wonder about appearances, hidden depths, serves as a powerful reminder. You shouldn't judge a book by its cover and underestimate anyone, the buyer concludes provocatively. A killer lurks in each of us, easy to observe in exceptional situations or wartime, offering this chilling universal observation drawn from the stark particularities of this man's life.
Okay, now let's turn to a particularly revealing, and I have to say, ethically complex episode recounted by the buyer. One that occurred on the black site and involved another patient, an Egyptian immigrant. This story illustrates the buyer's intensely personal struggle with alleged covert drugging within the institution, leading to an extraordinary and ethically fraught response.
Yeah, what's particularly striking here is the buyer's methodical, almost scientific approach to identifying the source of an alleged poisoning. They transform this deeply disturbing personal ordeal into a controlled experiment, albeit one with profound ethical considerations and a clear awareness of the moral compromises involved. It speaks to a desperate search for truth in a perceived environment of deception.
The buyer recounts this experience where, after some time, they once again dared to order soluble coffee powder from the black site's delivery service, holding on to this sliver of hope it wouldn't be contaminated this time. But after drinking it, boom, they were fully sedated again. A familiar, unwelcome sensation. Their first thought, out of frustration and anger, was just to throw the contaminated product in the trash. But then an idea, born of desperation and a dark sense of irony, struck them. Give it to my idiot German nightmare neighbor, then he'll finally shut up.
Wow.
It was a 300-gram pack of soluble gold coffee, cost the buyer about 10 euros. However, the neighbor, whom the buyer describes as this disgusting guy, unexpectedly refused the offer. Said he fundamentally never drank soluble coffee. This refusal, initially a setback, inadvertently sparked a new, more calculated idea in the buyer's mind. They wanted to find a test object, another patient, to whom they could give this poison and then closely observe the effects. Particularly to see if they noticed the coffee was contaminated, providing external validation for the buyer's suspicions.
Which makes you wonder about the buyer's desperation, right, and the ethical dilemma inherent in such an experiment. The ideal candidate for this unsettling test in the buyer's calculation would be someone taking no medications. This would ensure any observed effects can be attributed solely to the coffee, eliminating confounding variables. The buyer identified a patient in their airlock, the Schluss, this communal day room, whom they actually like very much, an immigrant from Egypt with a German passport. He'd studied artificial intelligence, shared the buyer's passion for video game.
Okay, so someone they liked.
Exactly. The buyer openly admits feeling scruples about doing this to someone they genuinely liked, acknowledges the evil nature of the act. However, the Egyptian patient was deemed the perfect candidate. He liked and drank a lot of soluble coffee, took no medication, and crucially, they had multiple daily personal interactions, providing ample opportunities for close observation. It highlights the buyer's difficult choice between personal ethics and this pressing need to validate what they experienced as conspiracy facts.
So the buyer, acting on this morally ambiguous plan, approached the Egyptian patient, offered him the pack of coffee as a gift. They feigned stomach problems from it, claimed they obviously couldn't tolerate it. The Egyptian, delighted by the unexpected gift, happily accepted. And with that, the test series began. The buyer, in their own words, acknowledges this was evil, but insists they needed a test to confirm their suspicions about the covert sedation. What's even more interesting, maybe adds another layer of complexity, is the deep rapport the buyer shared with the Egyptian. They often engaged in philosophical discussions about future AI applications, the development of artificial general intelligence, AGI, advanced AI training methods, quantum computers, robotics. The buyer found all these shared topics really exciting.
Okay.
The Egyptian even planned to start an AI startup, hoping to contribute to an AGI breakthrough himself.
Yeah.
The buyer found it very sympathetic that this Egyptian, a devout Muslim, openly enjoyed pork. The buyer even taught him how to make original Alsatian Flammkuchen, much to his great delight. The Egyptian was also doing well financially, receiving about €20 a month in early retirement due to psychological problems. Owned a new Xbox Series X, while the buyer only had an older Xbox One S. These details just underscore a genuine friendship that existed alongside the buyer's ethically challenging experiment.
And considering the wider implications, the Egyptian patient also had a violent past. A fact that adds another layer of tragic complexity to his story within Black Site Berlin. He was a murderer, had killed a man in a delusion. He genuinely felt his life and family were threatened. And after repeatedly going to the police who, in his view, did not imprison the man he feared, he felt he had no other choice and took matters into his own hands, viewing his actions as self-defense.
Wow. Self-defense for murder.
That's how he framed it, born from delusion and a perceived lack of official protection. This tragic history shapes his future plans. His strategy for release from the Black Site involved deportation to Egypt, where he believed he could bribe psychologists for permanent release for little money.
Bribe them.
He stated this was a feasible option in Egypt, reflecting a cynical understanding of institutional corruption. His financial well-being, that €1,000 a month, would certainly aid such a plan. But also, as we saw with the house slave, potentially made him vulnerable within the Black Site.
Right. So the buyer meticulously observed the effects of the coffee on the Egyptian. Whenever he consumed it, he became noticeably slow in thinking, unmotivated, and unfocused. The conversation quality sank immensely, a stark change from his usual enthusiastic demeanor.
Okay, clear difference.
The day after receiving the coffee, the difference was gravitatingly different. Deep, dark eye rings, glassy eyes, spoke very slowly. Slept almost all day, unable to even cook, which he usually did. Late that evening, just before lockdown at 10 p.m., he had to rush to put a lasagna in the oven at the last minute. Most tellingly, he missed his favorite video game show.
The one he never missed.
The one he never missed. Aired 11:30 p.m. Thursdays. That evening, he came to the buyer looking martyred, exhausted, asking them to record the show because he was too tired to watch it. The coffee had clearly exerted the well-known sedating effect on him, just as it had on the buyer. Despite his large stature, 1.90 meters, 110 kilograms, demonstrating the potency of the alleged contaminant.
And a critical point to consider here is just how difficult it is to identify subtle forms of manipulation or harm, particularly when the source is unknown. The buyer describes their own arduous, frustrating process of identifying the source of this sedation. Initially, they were unsuspecting, couldn't attribute the effects directly to poisoning or a specific source.
Right.
They first thought they might just be ill, sleep-deprived, wondering about their strange state but unable to grasp the true cause. It required, as the buyer explains, feeling precisely into one's body, an extensive prior experience with psychopharmaceuticals, drugs, alcohol, to accurately recognize how the mind changes under chemical influence, what that specific sensation truly signifies. One must listen closely to one's body to draw correct conclusions. If you unmistakably feel under the influence of something but haven't knowingly consumed it, then the painstaking trial and error process begins. Consuming suspected items individually, carefully avoiding others, observing effects for many days. Inevitably, in this process, you have to fall into the trap multiple times, endure sedation repeatedly.
That sounds exhausting.
Extremely. To be absolutely certain of a source, the buyer had to bite the bullet, consume suspicious items repeatedly, despite the certainty of being sedated. This was particularly difficult because, in the buyer's case, several sources existed simultaneously and constantly changed, making identification this continuous, harrowing challenge.
And throughout this observation period, the buyer couldn't help but wonder if the Egyptian would figure it out, eventually confront them. They were fully prepared for that moment, ready to immediately apologize, confess their status as a study object. The buyer intended to explain that this covert drugging had been happening to them for years from various changing sources, hoping for understanding. However, the weeks passed. The Egyptian was hardly seen on the station, fully sedated, confirming the potent, consistent effect of the coffee. He never once spoke to the buyer about the strange lethargy, the profound sedation he experienced.
Never said anything.
Not a word. Only after the 300 grams of coffee were completely finished did he noticeably become fitter, more active, his personality gradually returning to normal after a brief transition period. The experiment, for the buyer, had provided the chilling validation they sought. Okay, Now let's delve into another unique interaction within Blacksite Berlin. One that really highlights the psychological warfare the buyer perceives as being waged by the institution's staff. It involves a forced medication report, this document of alleged official control, and a completely unexpected, almost humorous nickname that emerged from its contents.
Yeah, what's particularly compelling here is the buyer's detailed account of confronting what they describe as just a barrage of lies, slander, and insults embedded within their own medical records. This act of defiance and the unforeseen consequences within the patient community offer this unique glimpse into the dynamics of truth and perception inside Blacksite Berlin.
The buyer was diligently working through an old forced medication report, a document they found incredibly frustrating, infuriating. Describe the process as having to really pull yourself together while reading it, given the sheer volume of so many lies, vile slanders, and insults within its pages.
Wow.
They felt the psychologists had made insulting their profession by inventing these intellectually sounding pseudoscientific technical terms specifically to demean them. And to add insult to injury, this entire derogatory assessment was then served up as an offer of help. The buyer, understandably, stated they were not amused.
Not surprised.
The original report, in its digital format on the Xbox, was 14 pages. However, the buyer's brief correction, their rebuttal of its contents, expanded to over 40 pages, simply because so much garbage was in it, requiring extensive counter-documentation.
40 pages of corrections.
Yeah.
Which immediately brings to mind the profound power dynamics within the Blacksite, right? And the often damaging impact of official documentation on an individual's self-perception, their reputation among peers. To effectively show other patients the defamatory garbage in their report, the buyer conceived of this unique approach. They held a best-of reading session in the kitchen for several patients, including all 3 from their airlock.
A reading session.
Yes. The buyer's primary intention was to have these fellow patients confirm that the claims made in the report were untrue, hoping their shared experience would validate the buyer's own perception of being unjustly maligned. During the session, the buyer read out particularly egregious highlights. Accusations that they were too stupid and crazy for personal hygiene, not house-trained, didn't know how to use a toilet, and, most dramatically, that all patients feared me and didn't dare leave their rooms because of me. The act was designed to expose the perceived absurdity of these official statements.
And this is where the narrative takes that compelling, unexpected turn into widespread amusement. As the buyer hoped, these absurd excerpts were met not with fear, but with outright disbelief, peals of laughter from the other patients, who asked, genuinely bewildered, why do they spread such obvious lies about me? It was this moment of shared incredulity at the institution's perceived fabrications. The buyer intentionally kept their true concerns about the underlying international law situation hidden from these patients, believing it would be useless to try and convince them of such complex conspiracy facts, as they were, in the buyer's view, as powerless and ill-equipped to understand the broader context as the buyer felt themselves to be.
Right.
However, the most amusing, the most baffling accusation came when the buyer read out what they called the disabled accusation. That there was always a danger that I would simply and suddenly, as if out of nowhere, raptus-like, attack fellow human beings.
Raptus-like.
Raptus-like. The report itself even admitted this had never occurred in reality, but claimed it was something to fear at any time. The buyer points out the inherent absurdity, noting such a vague, unevidenced threat could truly be said of anyone.
Yeah, that's wow. So the audience of patients was already highly amused, stunned by this litany of fabricated accusations. But this specific raptus-like accusation, given the buyer's known good mood, courtesy, friendliness qualities that fundamentally contradicted such an aggressive portrayal, it caused great amusement. It so thoroughly defied their actual persona.
Right.
The unforeseen, rather ironic consequence of this particular excerpt, the buyer immediately acquired a new, catchy nickname, Raptus.
Raptus.
Yes. Patients on the station began jokingly hiding in the hallway, calling out, "Oh, help, here comes Raptus," to tease and engage with the buyer. The buyer, in this remarkable display of embracing the absurd, plays along with this new identity, emitting a theatrical grrr, making a Tyrannosaurus Rex claw gesture with their hand, transforming a clinical insult into a playful interaction.
The buyer, reflecting on this unexpected turn, sees being called Raptus as actually better than an earlier, more uncomfortable nickname they'd been given King, a title they found far more awkward. So they intentionally don't spread the news about the King nickname among the other patients.
Okay.
The nickname Raptus inevitably reminds the buyer of the movie Jurassic Park and the small, agile, aggressive raptors that bite wildly in the film. They realize with a wry understanding that this is precisely how the psychologists are portraying them, as an unpredictable, dangerous, almost primitive threat. Ultimately, the buyer makes peace with it, adopting the nickname with this defiant acceptance. Okay, you have my permission, call me Raptus. It's a real moment of reclaiming agency in a system designed to disempower. Okay, our final dive into the buyer's experiences within Black Site Berlin takes us to their transfer to a new ward, Station 10C, and the immediate continuation of what they describe as poisoning gas, this chilling assertion of covert drugging despite their proactive attempts to avoid it. It's a story that really underscores the pervasive nature of the alleged control within this institution.
Yeah, what's particularly striking here is the buyer's expectation of a temporary reprieve from these alleged covert drugging tactics. The swift, brutal realization that the Black Site's methods of control are far more pervasive, immediate, and deeply entrenched than anticipated. It highlights the systemic nature of these conspiracy facts within the institution.
The buyer had hoped for a fresh start upon their transfer, thinking, new station, new luck. They specifically wanted to escape Station 10B due to being poisoned and gassed there. Found the situation unbearable. Believed a transfer would grant them some peace, at least for a while. While they couldn't rule out a recurrence entirely, their experience suggested there'd typically be a grace period.
Right, time for things to settle.
Exactly. Usually took a while, they reasoned, until all the Black Site staff on a new ward were infiltrated and fully capable of resuming these alleged covert activities. But the crucial twist, shattering their expectations, was this. This time, everything was different, no grace period, from the frying pan into the fire. The alleged methods of control were immediate and unrelenting on Station 10C.
Which makes you wonder about the alleged institutional consistency in these practices, right? Suggests a centralized, swift deployment of control mechanisms to preempt any potential forced medication by injection, which typically begins in isolation for non-compliant patients, and to actively avoid further poisoning and gassing. The buyer initially took liquid Risperdal voluntarily on Station 10C. This was a calculated move, an attempt to demonstrate compliance while covertly evading the medication's effects.
Okay.
The buyer's strategy was precise. Hold the liquid Risperdal in their mouth until out of sight of the nurses, then quickly spit it out, rinse their mouth at the bathroom faucet. This tactic, cunning as it was, initially worked. For the first few days, the buyer successfully avoided the sedating effects of the medication. This period of temporary success, however, was about to be abruptly ended.
But a critical, regrettable mistake occurred, revealing the profound sense of surveillance within Black Site Berlin. The buyer, in what they now describe as a lapse, confessed to a patient they had known for years, someone from Station 10B, implicitly trusted not to be a snitch, that they were spitting out the medicine.
Oh, dear.
This confession happened within the confines of their room. The buyers convinced they were overheard in their room, despite knowing the room was likely bugged. They acknowledged the foolishness of this action, stating they knew the room was bugged, but still committed this error. Stupid of me. The buyer had operated under this flawed assumption that merely taking the psychopharmaceuticals for the records would satisfy the Black Site staff, that they would have what they want, and that knowing the buyer wasn't actually swallowing the medicine would have no consequences for them. How wrong I was, the buyer laments, indicating the consequences were swift and severe.
And zooming out, the immediate, relentless nature of the alleged poisoning and gassing that followed, despite the buyer's calculated efforts to avoid it, it profoundly highlights the systemic, deeply entrenched nature of these conspiracy facts within Black Site Berlin. This rapid response to the buyer's revelation reinforces their view of an institution designed not for genuine therapy or rehabilitation, but for covert control, pervasive manipulation. This experience underscores the profound, almost inescapable sense of being under constant, unyielding surveillance and manipulation, where even the smallest deviation from perceived compliance leads to an immediate, overwhelming reassertion of control. It paints a chilling picture of an environment where individual agency is just systematically dismantled. #tag outro.
So, as we bring this deep dive to a close, we've really explored the extraordinary world inside Black Site Berlin, a place the buyer describes as a disguised, secret prison, all revealed through the unfiltered first-hand experiences of our narrator, the buyer. We've heard these harrowing accounts of individuals navigating a system where personal autonomy is just challenged at every single turn, where their very sanity is questioned through allegedly manipulated guardianship processes, and where covert sedation is a perceived daily reality, a tool, in their view, of the international deep state.
Yeah, we've delved into the really unsettling stories of its inhabitants. From MG, the car arsonist, whose psychologically compromised past as an informant for the professing Schutz became so deeply entangled with political narratives, public perception, to the tragic trajectory of the werewolf of Berlin, a fascinating cinephile who is also a serial killer, whose severe mental illness cast this long shadow over his life and the lives he tragically ended. We also examined the disturbing exploitation of the house slave, a gentle, elderly serial killer whose profound vulnerability and financial resources are callously disregarded, even abused by other patients, and most disturbingly, by the institution itself.
And perhaps most chillingly, we walked through the buyer's calculated, ethically fraught experiment with the Egyptian patient, revealing the extraordinary lengths one individual went to identify and understand the pervasive poison and gases tactics within Black Site Berlin. This entire deep dive, it really challenges our conventional understanding of psychiatric care, doesn't it? It forces us to confront the boundaries of institutional power and the narratives it seeks to impose.
Absolutely. These accounts, presented as conspiracy facts by the buyer, they paint a stark, unsettling picture of Black Site Berlin as a disguised secret prison, operating in their view under the guise of an international deep state, where personnel allegedly act on behalf of various state interests, German, American, and Russian. The narratives force us to confront the possibility of obscured agendas, deliberate manipulation, within systems ostensibly designed for oversight and protection. It makes you question the very nature of their purpose.
So what does this all mean for you, listening? Consider this. If the line between genuine care and calculated control can become so blurred, so indistinguishable within a supposedly therapeutic setting, and if the very definition of fact can be so deeply personal, so contested within such a system, how does this alter your understanding of truth, of personal agency, and maybe of the hidden structures that might subtly influence our perceptions of reality in the wider world around us? It's definitely a question worth pondering long after this deep dive concludes.